This is
Tomorrow's World. Life's big questions. Answered.
How's
Sure.
the sound? This is looking wonky. Wait. We have to introduce Tomorrow's World every time, don't we?
Yeah.
Welcome back to Tomorrow's World.
I am Britt Ray.
I'm Ellie Cosgrave. And in this episode, we get to talk about my favourite subject.
Ellie's going to nerd out hard.
I'm so excited. This episode is about cities.
Cities and what might happen to them in the future.
Massive global challenges we have at the moment. We've got 1 million people moving to cities every week.
What?
Between now and 2050.
Sorry, 1 million every week?
1 million a week to cities around the world.
Generally, when you average it out.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
By 2050, we're going to have 70% of the world's population living in cities. And we've got climate change to deal with. There's so many massive engineering challenges.
Okay, but how do you keep hope amidst all of this chaos?
Well, there are loads of options. The context has changed. What we want from a city is totally different. Some people think, let's make them float.
Let's make them float? Amazing. This is Hope Floats.
I wanted to see what a floating community really would feel like. What would it be like to live there? So about a mile away,
So we're on the south side of the Thames.
there is a floating community sitting on the Thames, and it is overlooked by
Just east of City Hall and Tower Bridge.
one of our most famous landmarks in London, Tower Bridge.
And as you'll see, we've got quite a view.
Oh, wow.
Okay, Ellie, this is all sounding a little bit like some kind of Richard Curtis film. It's Notting Hill or Love Actually, and we've got Hugh Grant here
My name's Harry, by the way.
bringing us into a super romantic setting, you know.
Picture postcard London. 1 million miles from anywhere I could ever afford to live.
London, summer night. There's Tower Bridge just off in the distance with this incredibly charming gentleman just showing you around his
A ramshackle but rather beautiful collection of repurposed boats and barges.
dilapidated but beautifully crafted living stead, which just happens to be a DIY boat. It's like, the whole thing's pretty seductive.
And so this is where I spend my days and years, bobbing with the tide and the ducks.
There's a beautiful setting sun that just sets neatly in between the two columns of Tower Bridge. Yeah, I mean, yeah. In many ways, that does make for a really lovely story. I mean, the reality is... And you've got... Oh, it's a bit windy. We enter through this iron gate.
To the left here, we've got Tower Bridge.
There's just Tower Bridge. Smell of the Thames.
And the smell of the Thames.
I think quite a lovely smell.
It's not as bad as you'd think.
No, I like it. When we were walking down, we were walking over...
We're going over a very narrow walkway here. This is the bridge.
The bridge was creaking.
Out to the main infrastructure. As you can see, there's lots of old, rusty bits and pieces, lots of projects on the go as well.
It's in the middle of London, underneath the Heathrow flight path.
Yeah, I mean, it's not quaint. It's like the whole vibe of the place is really...
It's very much...
It feels very eco.
Well, it's sort of part of the aesthetics all being cobbled together.
And we got to these...
The main body of the mooring is these 6 or 7 garden barges.
On top of them, they're the gardens where people kind of walk through. And there's like community barges where they'll get together and have their parties. And then the places where people actually live.
So the tide's on its way out at the moment, pretty much as far down as it will go. And yet in an hour or two, we'll be back up afloat.
This is kind of a community that is movable, evolving and floating on the Thames. Can I see your boat?
Yeah, absolutely. So my boat is this one here.
Oh,
She's called the Lotus. It's an old Dutch barge, but she's been converted to live in. Do you want to come have a look inside? Yeah, come in. So this is Lotus.
Oh my God, it's beautiful. That floor is incredible.
Yeah, welcome. So we've got a little kitchen here, sitting room over here. I mean, it's not a big space, but it does work.
That's a proper full-on normal oven.
Yeah, we've set up pretty much like a normal flat.
Hot plate.
With a few differences, like we've got this wood-burning stove, which is our main source of heat in the winter.
Where you'd snuggle up to read an old famous novel. And probably smoke a cigar.
We would call that hygge in Denmark.
Hygge. Definitely hygge-y.
Translates to cozy, but it's not quite the same thing.
Which is surprising on a converted barge slap bang in the middle of the Thames. It actually felt quite yeah, cozy. Hygge.
There you go.
Wait a second, Britt. Who are these guys?
I'm Chris, and with Dale here, we'll be your mystery floaters for today.
Mystery floaters. I love it. This
I'm
is so exciting
already.
Okay. Hi, Chris and Dale.
Hey, Chris. Hey, Dale.
Hi. Here's your first clue on our floater.
Clues. Oh my gosh, detective show. Let's hear what they have to say.
I love mysteries.
Where are you? What kind of floater are you on?
It's going to be headed to the sort of conditions we've never really had to deal with before. And it's going to be a challenge to get it in place and then get it set up quickly enough before things go south.
So our mystery floaters, Chris and Dale, are on a mission to create a special technological apparatus that can float in a very special,
far away place. It's not somewhere we get to often. It's going to be super difficult to get there. Okay, so hopefully at some point we'll work out where Chris and Dale are, but we're going to have more clues from our mystery floaters later, so keep listening.
Perfect, yes. I think that will be a nice story. We can tell you where we came from, where we are, and where we will go to. So it's...
That's exactly what we're looking for. Perfect.
This is Koen Oltewitz. He is an architect who's dealing with floating structures.
The very first floating structure that I built was very, very successful because it measured like 1 feet by 1 feet. It was a very small floating terrace for ducks. And they had this little baby ducks and they couldn't swim. So we had to make a terrace so that they can climb on top of it. And I think it stayed there for 4 or 5 years and the ducks were very happy. So I can say that was my most successful building ever.
Dutch accents get me every time. Wow.
Holland has been always threatened by the water for the last few hundred years. And we've always thought that the only way to live here is to be defensive.
They've built levees and dikes and they've reclaimed land from the sea.
Dry land. We see that's not enough. We also have to start living with the water. See water as a friend and not only as an enemy.
So it's flipping the script that they've had historically, always trying to defend themselves from the threat of water and just... What are these guys called again?
Water Studio is an office for floating architecture worldwide.
And what they do there is build floating everythings.
What we started with our office, we were working on some floating houseboats and small water houses. But already we saw that there were more opportunities.
Structures that could be pavilions, blocks.
Big floating foundations, which you can use.
Apartments, you name it.
Not only in Holland, but in almost every big city around the world.
They're basically envisioning this future in which we could float around in our cities.
The world is being threatened by sea level rise, threatened by urbanization. There's no space, there's no flexibility, and there's no safety against floods and tsunamis. So if you bring that all together, then this typical Dutch subject of living on water can be a global solution for cities in the future.
So essentially what they do is create these floating foundations, and these are massive concrete blocks that acts as basically massive barges that can support whatever structure that you want to put on top of it.
People come sometimes to us and they ask us, well, you make floating developments, that should be magic. How can a house float? But in reality, it's quite simple. We make concrete ships, concrete boats, and they're not in the shape of a ship, but they are rectangular.
Yeah, if we just turn round, we've got a big container ship being dragged along by a couple of barges.
That's Professor Philip Wilson. He is a professor.
He's one of the big ones, the really big ones.
At the University of Southampton, where he teaches ship dynamics.
Nice.
Well, we've just arrived now into Southampton on Mayflower Park. We're down right by the water, you can hear in the background. We're on a small beach, so let's go ahead and talk about ships and floating cities.
100%. Go Phil.
The first question I'm always asking in a pub is, why do ships float when there's so much steel in them? Well, actually, there's a lot of space there as well, and you get buoyancy, and it's buoyancy actually supports the weight.
Okay.
Are you about to break down buoyancy?
I'm going to try.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So if you think about the thin layer of steel that you have on the outside of the ship, now, you reckon that steel is super heavy, right?
Yeah.
So you've got a massive weight bearing down, creating this dip, essentially wanting to sink. But what you also have in that is empty space. A big void in the middle of this ship.
Yeah.
which is not heavy at all.
Are you about to break down buoyancy?
Empty space, bearing down, creating this dip, empty space,
Break down buoyancy.
dip, empty space.
Yeah.
Not heavy at all. Dip, empty space,
Buoyancy.
dip, empty space. Big void in the middle of this ship. Not heavy at all. Empty space.
Yeah.
Bearing down, creating this dip, empty space. The weight of all of that empty space
Yeah.
has to be less than the upthrust provided by the sea,
Yeah.
creating this dip. The volume of water displaced is heavier than the ship, empty space.
In order to float.
You're going to float. Dip, empty space.
In order to float.
You're going to float.
Buoyancy.
Bearing down, creating this dip, empty space.
Yeah.
You're going to float. Dip, empty space.
Break down buoyancy.
Dip, empty space.
Yeah. In order to float.
Buoyancy. Yes. Well, what do you build a ship out of is the next normal question. Steel. And we build them out of wood, of course. Glass reinforced plastics, composite materials. And we build them out of concrete as well. Ships out of concrete are still made. We already have floating small cities at sea already.
Philip says that we've actually already got habitable,
All the things you want for a big city, we've got on
small floating, what he calls
pods, effectively, already at sea. So offshore platforms people live on for many weeks at a time.
that have electricity, that have
Fresh water, brown water, black water.
sanitation, all of the things that we need that are supporting very small communities to survive at one time.
We have some experience as naval architects to do that.
Like, this is totally possible. But what happens when we want to make them more massive?
How do we do it for a massive city? It depends on the size of the city you want. If you want to deal with Southampton at sea, 250,000 people, that's a big city, isn't it, at sea?
So we can create floating foundations, technically the same as a boat, but in reality they are so big and so large that they have the stability and the comfort of normal building ground.
Architect Kuhn from Water Studio again.
So you can build almost anything you want.
So if you want to build a highway, you can do that.
Houses, roads, gardens.
Whole neighborhoods.
You even can go to high-rise buildings. It's just a balance between size of the foundation, the depth of the water, and the height of the structure on top of it.
The magic of a floating city is that you can remold it, reconfigure it.
Imagine a city where you can just plug and play, bring floating houses, floating developments, floating roads, floating parks, festivals on water, to adjust to the needs and demands from that moment.
Kuhn paints a picture of Holland. He says it's very hot in the summer and very cold in the winter.
So it would be much easier and better if you could adjust the cities for the season.
We know that water has a massive cooling effect. Why not move the houses or buildings slightly more apart in the summer?
To let developments breathe.
At the moment we have huge issues in cities with urban heat islands, which is cities are about 2 degrees hotter than the rest of their surroundings.
Let them open, let them change configuration, let them rotate, let them move from one part of the city to the other part of the city.
We can actually engineer the very fabric of the city to mould and breathe, and that only works because it's floating.
But the ones that we built in reality are the floating houses.
Just like a house that you would recognize on land, but now floating on the water, also subject to the same kinds of regulations that normal houses are, and that's why it's different from a houseboat. It really is a house that floats.
As an architect, you're just like an artist. You have some clients who want a floating villa, or you have a developer who wants a floating building, but in the end, you maybe can make like 100, 150 clients happy in your lifetime. So that is that's not enough.
I know people have talked about floating cities for those who've got a lot of money, but we have to think of the larger population use of it as well.
So what we try to do is we also try to bring our technology to the real big problems worldwide. And one of the big problems are slums.
Currently, we have billions of people across the world living in slums, and 50% of those slums
are around water.
There are many in the world, Lagos, Mumbai, various cities in the world, which have huge populations, and the problem is they live in not very nice situations, slum cities. So maybe it's a way of actually helping their lives, making a much better life.
There is no bank, there is no investor, there's no municipality who wants to invest in places that are being threatened by the water and threatened by the floods. So if you can come up with some small floating developments that improve life in slums, we call these solutions city apps.
And what Koen is describing is these foundations that can just be
almost container-like solutions.
A simple raft supported by some foam or plastic bottles that are buoyant.
PET bottles plastic bottles that you can find almost everywhere, tied together and place a container on top of it.
So that once you build a structure on them, they will be able to float.
Mm-hmm. And the great thing is that now investors are willing to invest because they can build a small school.
So imagine these schools made essentially out of bottles.
And once there is eviction in such a slum or there is some change in rules or regulations, you can just move these kind of floating buildings, floating structures to another slum, or you can put them on the truck and you can move them to another city.
Okay, so they're working right now in Dhaka in Bangladesh to try this out.
We work together with UNESCO in Delft. So in the end, it would be fantastic if we can do with less money, have more effect and help the people who really need it.
Let us know when you're ready.
I'm ready.
Fantastic. Okay, so if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
I'm Joe Quirk. I'm an author and I'm a seavangelist.
I spoke to Joe Quirk, who calls himself a seavangelist, and he is the visionary for the Seasteading Institute, who want to make cities float.
I love his pun use.
Oh, he's so good at puns. I mean, tighten your seatbelts. The puns are coming thick and fast.
Oh my gosh.
What does a seavangelist mean?
A seavangelist is someone who is so convinced we can create better worlds on the ocean that they act like an evangelist.
That's excellent. I love it. So why are you so convinced of that?
Well, seasteading solves two problems at once, and they are two of the most important problems in the world.
One is sea level rise, and the other is what he calls
bankrupt governments stuck in the 20th century.
And he thinks that the solution to that is to
break away and try something new.
Create cities from scratch that can be floating.
45% of the Earth's surface is unclaimed by any country.
International waters.
And we want to provide the technology for anybody to start their own nanonation.
So he hopes that we can take advantage of the 45% of unclaimed water and set up our own nanonation within it.
Right.
We're going to start very small with an incubation hub for blue tech.
The first seastead to be built will be in French Polynesia. Now, you may think, wait a second, these are supposed to be floating cities. They're out of any national jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. Well, the problem with that is,
only oil exploration and fossil fuel companies can afford floating in high waves.
It's still really expensive to make it work and make it viable.
So we wanted to start much more modestly in shallow waters where the technology for floating cities already exists.
The Seasteading Institute are partnering with this company, DeltaSync, to...
Yes, DeltaSync has a vision for a sort of organically adjusting city.
From what I understand and what I've seen, it's a network of pentagon and square-shaped blocks that are essentially reconfigurable. Is that right?
Yes.
If I was looking from the top, a bird's eye view.
If we're going to float, we might be floating on pentagons.
Pentagons.
Or squares.
Or squares. Hexagons.
That all connect together in a big grid.
And what's interesting about these shapes is that it allows them to filigree and form different designs. sort of like Venice. So imagine if Venice was like a puzzle piece and you could rearrange it how you like.
The square block would be about 50 meters squared, and the pentagons would have about 50-meter long edges.
When one is moved around to another position, it detaches from where it just was and then reattaches in a new area.
Approaching each other and locking into place, seamlessly connecting the utilities pipes, the water pipes, the energy.
This would be a startup country. This would be a startup legal system. You attract all sorts of people. People just like seaweed farmers and algae farmers. People as benign as that come to the Seasteading Institute saying, I can solve a huge social problem if you just grant me a new jurisdiction that floats. And as long as people can choose them voluntarily, create them voluntarily, and quit them voluntarily, we think better solutions will emerge from that sort of market of competing little city-states on the ocean.
This really strong narrative of getting rid of regulations and the things that are holding us back sounds a lot like, libertarian ideas of government is bad and we should be able to have unbridled competition, capitalism, take over.
We could be living in ways that we can't even imagine now. And he says that you can, if that island is not providing you what you want, just go to another island. You have to. Yeah. I know, it's tricky. I know.
I'm so uncomfortable with such. I'm fairly hesitant to just jump on board with what I'm hearing so far, but I want to hear more.
I hear you.
Yeah.
It's going to be very difficult for a tyrant to ascend that sort of natural hierarchy when your island can sort of disassemble beneath you and people can leave as you're behaving badly.
His contingency is that everyone will always have the right to leave. But how do you enforce rights? Legal systems.
The long-term view is that we'll actually move more than 200 miles offshore and be in international waters. And then you would have man-made islands that would be truly startup nations.
So hold on a sec. Do I have this right? Where I can imagine that they're going to build the first seastead in the waters of French Polynesia, close enough so that people on the mainland can see them, wave in the morning, look over at them having their coffee, etc., while they're anchored. They're tethered for a while they're building and testing their prototype. And then one day, after being great guests there for a while, they're going to snip the cord and sail out 200 miles offshore to become more autonomous as a micronation floating at sea.
Well, that's quite a beautiful image. I think the technology of the shallow water floating city is going to be different enough to the deep water city construction that they'll probably need to change it. But the view for the company is that they will transition from these shallow cities to deep water cities.
Ah, I see. Okay, shallow waters are always close to land.
Exactly. And the tether that you cut is more of a legal and political tether.
Nice. Yeah, baby steps.
Yeah.
Okay.
The initial stages, it's going to be, so small and just have, maybe 100 people. But I think once it scales up to 500 and then 1,000 people.
And I saw that you already have 1,000 people who have expressed an interest or who would live on that floating city.
If you tell the world you're going to create a fundamentally new society, not from the ground up, but the water up, people come to you. People are so eager to be pioneers and be on the cutting edge of the new world.
And it's not cheap. It's going to be about $15 million per module. Originally, they're thinking maybe 11 modules that would fit together in nice shapes, which will house about 200 to 300 citizens, and then about another 50 beds for hotels for people to come and visit.
And as long as there's no political backlash to people scaling up seasteading, I think it will definitely work.
But that's a huge if, isn't it?
Yeah.
As long as there's no political backlash to what we're doing. Joe calls this a widespread misunderstanding that what they're really trying to do is a tax haven and avoiding being part of global governance. I don't know.
Okay.
I already see that is going to cause widespread political backlash.
Well, that's a huge point. What about the possibility of it just becoming a tax haven?
Did you say tax benefits?
No, accountability of the people who are running it to ensure that it's a good environment.
Right. I want to create a system for governance where we're not relying on the good intentions of, say, politicians who make promises.
Are we allowed to criticize our guests on the show? I mean, I don't feel like I should, but I just get so uncomfortable with some of this language.
I think we need to. And I think I personally wouldn't be comfortable buying fully into this. The other problem I have is that I get really seasick. Is that something that is going to be an issue with these structures?
Seasteads have to be seasick free. It's absolutely necessary for people to be comfortable when they're on seasteads.
I don't get seasick.
Oh, mate, it's horrible.
Yeah, I bet. Literally nauseating.
It really ruins my yachting.
Yeah.
What's that type of drink? I call it the martini test. So when I'm on a cruise ship and I order a martini and the waiter can pour it right up to the brim and it doesn't spill, I know I'm in civilization, or as I like to call it, civilization.
Oh, sorry, civilization?
Yeah.
You're only civilized when you get a martini full to the brim on a cruise ship and it doesn't spill over.
I don't know why you're laughing. That's an illustration of how stable these places need to be.
How bougie they need to be.
And how boozy and stable. So we only puke from alcohol, not seasickness.
Oh, I said bougie like bourgeois.
Oh, I see. I heard boozy because that's how I roll.
In the initial stages, seasteads are going to be in shallow waters, anchored to the seafloor, which will create a kind of stability.
There are technologies that already exist that will enable us to do that. We just need to make sure that they're affordable and buildable at this scale. The problem is when you get into deep sea.
So there's lots of ways to create stability on the oceans. When we go out into deeper waters,
he talks about the fact that we already have oil thingies. Rigs.
Platforms. They're frequently stable enough for the people who live there 2 weeks out of 4 to play ping pong.
He talks about deep ballasts.
So way below the waves, you can create a lot of weight such that some structures can remain as stable as a fence post in 40-foot waves.
As stable as a fence post in these 40-foot waves. I know that my fence post fell down last year, so more stable than that one.
The ship that's going by is a big container vessel with loaded to the maximum with its containers. That doesn't look like you could bend that, but you can.
Professor Philip Wilson.
Regularly they bend a little bit, but sometimes they bend an awful lot with big wave systems. So we see them all over the place from big storms.
So there's a big difference between building a floating city way out in the ocean and building a floating city in shallow water just off the coast of your regular land.
Waves. You can probably hear the waves in the background. They're small little waves today. It's a nice sunny day and there's no big wind blowing, so there's only small waves. They're 20 centimetres high. But when we're out at sea in the big oceans, we're dealing with waves up to 20 metres high. And if you're at sea on those waves, you can only do one thing. You go up and down with them.
Philip is so not optimistic about this. From all of his years of ship design, and he's been doing this for a very long time, he has not come across a sea object that doesn't get severely bashed about and moved.
Now, if you built a floating city where you're making half the population seasick, that's not going to be economically viable, is it? Because people don't like living like that. They want to have a nice environment to live in.
He thinks that people are dreaming of this land away from all the troubles of everyday life, when really it's quite a brutal, uninhabited environment. And it's uninhabited, he thinks, for quite a good reason.
Well, the weather systems at sea are big. The weather is worse at sea because there's a longer fetch for the wind to blow over. And as a consequence, the waves are there.
Britanelli. I am Graham Hately. I am Chief Officer aboard an emergency response and rescue vessel, and it's our job to look after the oil platforms and oil rigs in the North Sea. We are currently operating about 100 miles northeast of the Shetland Islands. That's halfway to Norway. We will experience 3 to 4 storms a year, sometimes reaching hurricane force. It's not unusual for us to have winds of over 100 knots or 120 miles an hour. These sort of conditions will generate waves of 20 or 30 metres in height.
Forces from the big waves are massive.
Last Christmas we were at sea.
And we're talking of megatons.
And on Boxing Day we had Storm Connor.
Jesus done it. Hang on.
This is a real recording.
This is actually kind of a properly aggressive environment.
Hang on.
You are trying to eat, you are trying to sleep, whilst being hit with a great big hammer every time a wave hits, and tilted to 30-degree angles constantly, day after day after day. Anything that floats, no matter how big, will move. Hold on to your martini.
What's that type of drink?
That martini would not be able to stay still. It would not even be within your reach because it could move so quickly out of it.
Into my hand.
Yeah, probably. I wonder if it means that it only makes sense to build these structures in the shallow waters that are really close to nations and therefore in their jurisdictions.
Right. Or potentially there are some hotspots that we don't know about.
Yeah.
I mean, we have hurricanes ripping through land, and we sometimes survive them.
Right. Yeah, it's a new way of putting ourselves at risk.
We're always finding new ways of doing that.
Exactly.
Chris and Dale again. Our mystery floaters are back.
Hi.
Do you smell a clue?
Before we send the humans there, we need to send some robot ships out there to just check out the environment and understand better what the humans will be experiencing. If you look at extreme environments like Mars that we've explored in the past.
Big clue there.
So somewhere like Mars.
If this is a mystery and they've already been talking about Mars, it's not Mars. Where else might humans be sent to?
Moons of other planets or other planets themselves.
So I'm thinking that Chris and Dale might be astronauts at this point.
Right, you're buying into the space thing.
Yeah.
So as I'm leaning back in my deck chair, sipping from my martini that doesn't spill because waves are not an issue.
Here's Joe, our Seavangelist again.
I'm on pilings high above the waves, supported by deep ballast, which supports my city. And I'm looking out over seaweed farms, providing all sorts of jobs to immigrants that want to move there and improve their lives. And I think we could unleash the genius of all those people. In the same way, my Irish ancestors could never imagine what their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would experience on this new giant island of America when they moved there. I think we're going to be in the same situation in 100 years if we can continue to push forward the frontier and build our own islands on the ocean.
That's what he says. Obviously, there's a lot of problematic things within that.
I mean, I really don't mean to rain on the parade of innovative thinking because I think it's great that people like Joe go out and they dream big and they're ambitious and they will do the work to set up a whole new system, which takes guts, bravery, courage, because of course you're going to be criticized along the way. It's a radical transformation that's being proposed. And we don't know whether these things that we are kind of chiding about and wondering about because, we have our own personal criticisms. That shouldn't hold anyone back if we haven't tested them yet. But it does. I mean, I can't erase history as we know it, and I can't detract this from the societal entanglements of which it's born. The whole idea that we even need to get off of the land and onto something like that.
If you've asked me what the future of cities will be.
When Koen envisions the future dream city scenario,
mostly people hope that we will say, yeah, we love to have a floating city on the middle of the ocean. But that's not my answer.
He thinks that we should be working towards the most efficient cities ever.
The cities that can adapt to any change and that just looks great.
They might be half floating, but they also might be half on land.
Cities that can change configuration. When you come in summer, it will look different than in winter. Cities that can grow when we have a lot of refugees.
The cities could expand to accommodate them and then shrink after they depart, if they do.
Yeah, it's like an extending table.
Beautiful hybrid cities, half on land, half on water. And that cities like London, New York, Tokyo will reinvent themselves and will grow to something better than the ones we have today.
If humanity is to continue for another million years, our future lies in boldly going where no one else has gone before.
Stephen Hawking says that humans must colonize another planet within 100 years to have a chance.
That speeds up things a bit.
100 years?
That's soon.
That's around the corner.
Human colonization on other planets is no longer science fiction. It can be science fact.
Right, so in case some existential threat hits the planet, we've got somewhere we can go to make sure that humanity can continue.
We need a plan B.
Hello, Britt and Ellie. One of the missions I'm extremely interested in is a mission to our sister planet.
Here's science fiction author Jeffrey Landis.
I'm out at the NASA John Glenn Research Center, where I do research on developing technology for new space missions.
Who also happens to have worked a lot with NASA in his career.
They've been doing some great work. They've been working hard at trying to turn some of the science fiction ideas that I've been working on into real engineering reality.
Oh my gosh! Our mystery floaters are here.
I'm Dale Arney. I'm an aerospace engineer and the Space Mission Analysis branch here at NASA Langley Research Center.
NASA.
And I'm Chris Jones and was the other lead for the study.
Aha, nice one. So they're scientists at NASA.
The co-leads of Project Havoc.
Boom.
Project Havoc.
So hopefully that's an acronym, hey?
Let's ask Jeffrey.
The Havoc high-altitude Venus concept. Okay, excellent. We're thinking if we're going to go out, if we're going to make a home in space, let's colonize Venus, one of the most interesting planets in the solar system.
Whoa, we got it.
Venus.
Nice. Oh my God.
We see Venus as potentially one of the first destinations that humans might eventually try and expand out to beyond the cradle of Earth.
I love those guys. They're looking at the early steps. How would you send humans to Venus?
So with the initial concept we looked at, we envisioned it just being a crew of 2. You're looking at needing to use the full capability of the Space Launch System that NASA is working on developing. Crew of 2.
Rendezvous.
Crew of 2.
The crew rendezvous.
Okay, so here's the deal. You have 2 rockets leaving Earth.
The vehicle that's sending the crew, as well as
the place that they're going to live.
The actual vehicle that's going to operate at the destination.
Somewhere to dock into, somewhere to go. Venus.
Rendezvous.
Crew of 2.
Venus.
Rendezvous.
Crew of 2.
Venus. The crew rendezvous with the airship, which is all packaged up in an entry shell in Venus orbit. And so the 2 vehicles would come together, and these 2 docking ports would come together.
They're going to be going from something that, might be the size of a small house into something not much bigger than a large van
that they'll live in while they're down in Venus.
So hopefully they like each other. They're starting from an orbit of about 300 kilometers around Venus, and they're moving at over 7,000 meters per second. So they've got a lot of slowing down to do.
Venus sounds like a scary place, though.
I mean, I didn't think that they could possibly support human life anywhere close to Venus.
Yeah, Mars, I kind of get, is an inhabitable place, but Venus is...
I don't know enough about Venus, actually. They'll probably tell us.
I'm
but-
sure.
Yeah.
Very similar to Earth in some ways, and very different from Earth in others.
So at the surface, there are clouds that you would see if you were down there looking up that are whipping by overhead, but
Venus is Earth's evil twin.
You wouldn't necessarily live very long to see those clouds go by.
It is a hostile place to live.
From the very few pictures we've ever been able to take, because most cameras we've sent down there have died, it looks to be a very rocky surface.
Venus is the hell planet.
This hellish hellscape that's got temperatures hot enough to melt lead and pressures like you're 1,000 meters below the ocean.
It has an average temperature of about 450 degrees C. Ferocious place. Very difficult place if you want to live.
Yeah, anything that we've ever sent there has pretty much... Well, they say it's died, which I think is a nice, respectful way to talk about technology.
So that would be an almost impossible environment to go to.
However, like Earth, as you go higher up in the atmosphere of Venus cools down. Where the atmospheric pressure has dropped down to a pressure like the atmospheric pressure of Earth, 55, maybe 60 kilometers above the surface of Venus. At cloud top level, Venus is the paradise planet. Is actually the most Earth-like environment in the solar system. You're looking down on the brilliant white clouds because you're above the thick cloud deck of Venus. If we had a colony, if we had people that were living out in space, we would really want them to have gravity. If the astronauts don't work very hard at it, their bone mass will decrease by about 1% a month. It turns out, amazingly enough, Venus is a planet almost the same size as Earth, and it has a surface gravity that's almost the same as Earth. So if you were floating, say 55, 60 kilometers above the surface of Venus, it would feel very Earth-like.
Great thing about Venus is the atmosphere is extremely dense.
The atmosphere of Venus is mostly carbon dioxide, which is good.
We're talking about an airship that is operating at a density below sea level on Earth, and so it actually, for a given volume, has a lot of lifting power compared to what you're used to.
If you make balloons that are big, floating in this carbon dioxide atmosphere, you could float whole cities.
I think the magic thing about a balloon for space travel is the fact that it's fairly unmassive. You can fold it up and put it away so that you can actually leave the atmosphere of Earth, but then you can inflate it and make actually big structures when you get out into space by inflating it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why balloons are so appealing for people working in space technologies.
Yeah, Russia and the US have already sent balloons to Venus.
The first thing we would start doing is putting humans into the atmosphere of Venus, but not necessarily starting out with Cloud City. We'd start out with actually zeppelins floating in the atmosphere of Venus.
So what we're talking about here is a roughly 60 metric ton rocket suspended from an airship that's half the size of the Hindenburg.
Once the crew transfers over into that airship, it enters into the atmosphere, all packaged up and deflated.
There's no sound in space, but as you're starting to go into this Venusian atmosphere, you are going to start to hear some things. It'll sound rather like what the astronauts experience whenever they're coming back into Earth's atmosphere. A lot of shaking, a lot of rattling.
it needs to slow down before
Because if it
gets
doesn't,
there.
it's going to hit the 450 degrees Celsius surface.
Yeah, the rocky, brutal surface that we want to avoid that big time. We want alive astronauts, please, NASA.
You begin deploying this very large parachute, much bigger than probably any parachute we've ever used in a space mission before.
The biggest parachute that NASA has ever made for a spacecraft, a mega up parachute.
To begin pulling on the packaged airship
that we've had folded up in the back of our spaceship to get there.
So that it begins to unfurl as it comes down. You're able to begin inflating that airship using helium tanks that are attached to it.
Helium to make it effectively an incredibly buoyant thing.
And it looks a bit like a Zeppelin.
And yeah, think of the Hindenburg.
Do you remember, Dale, is that kind of above some of the clouds, or is it right there in it?
It's right at the top of the clouds.
Okay.
So they kind of fluctuate.
Yeah.
And so you've got this little pod still underneath that being held up by this huge, essentially balloon.
Yeah.
Buoyant in the atmosphere of Venus and travel around, enabling them to do their science and collect all the information that they're going to need to know about this area of Venus.
The airship's now able to begin its conventional operations, riding those winds around the surface of, or around Venus.
And then they're going to pack it in by deflating the helium, returning to the capsule.
Well, actually, they leave the helium behind. They're not that bothered about what happens to the balloon. They just detach their own capsule from that.
Right.
Launch the rockets, get back up, out, and back to their pod that will take them home safely.
It's so radical. Yeah, it's amazing. It's just, to achieve that is, wow. I wish them luck. It's so cool, but...
Yeah, well, and they said to us, like, at the moment, it's the idea, it's the concept, they're working out how to make this possible.
All of this is theoretical, folks.
Right.
Yeah.
But theoretically, very possible.
If you're wondering how we got the sound of a spacecraft entering the atmosphere of a planet, this is a real recording from NASA. The real sound of a booster that went up with a space shuttle but then fell off backwards into the atmosphere of Earth and plunged into the sea. Pretty intense and pretty cool. Which brings us conveniently back to where we started. Water, floating.
Something that really strikes me as we've been weaving our way through this episode is that there seems to be a fundamental idea that we can come up with technological engineering solutions to social problems. We heard from Seasteading that actually if we just build another floating island, then it will solve the problem of government incapability. And I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced by that argument myself.
It's, the same planet, same Earth, the same people that we're dealing with. I don't think that we should be approaching this as some kind of political utopia. That, to me, seems a little bit naive.
Right. Yeah, and remember that we're not talking only about these mega structures out in the middle of the sea. We also heard from Kuhn, who's creating these floating foundations that enable houses to be built right by existing cities that may be a solution to housing shortages in coastal cities or in cities with a river, which are many, many of our cities around the world.
Mm-hmm.
They're a real plausible solution.
I don't think that we will completely live on water, but I think we will have this beautiful hybrid cities, half on land, half on water.
It takes the idea of cities to the next level of being its own organism that breathes and adapts and reacts to anything that's being put onto it as a pressure. From the outside. Or the inside.
Wherever the pressure comes from below, from above.
Yeah, I mean, what would your dream for a hyper-adaptable city in 50 years be?
That it, totally understands human needs. That I think a lot of the time when we're designing cities, we forget that the reason we want to be in cities is because of my connection to you. So I don't know what the physical manifestation of that is, but I know that in that city, I will feel super connected to people. I will feel safe walking down the street. I will feel happy seeing the birds fly past. I will feel like this ultimate sense of connection. And I think infrastructure and the spaces that we make have a real possibility to accommodate that. If we can build these adaptable places, then what feels safe as a place in summer or even during the day might change at night, and the physical infrastructure could change that.
Yeah.
So you could just morph it.
It sounds good.
Yeah, I like it.
And so, although this is totally theoretical right now, is NASA proposing that we could live full-time permanently out in the atmosphere in a floating city of Venus?
Then we would build up to this city where lots of people could come and go and live really long durations.
It sounds like it.
Almost indefinitely in this new environment.
Our not-so-mystery floaters, scientists Chris and Dale.
So Jeff Landis of NASA has written a number of papers describing this idea of having an entire floating city where people live inside of the volume of air that's being used to float in the clouds of Venus.
Jeffrey Landis again.
One of the interesting things about Venus, of course, is that ordinary breathable air will float in the atmosphere. So if you make balloons that are big, floating in this carbon dioxide atmosphere, you could float whole cities.
Because breathable air is actually more buoyant than the carbon dioxide that makes up Venus's atmosphere.
I reckon we could put this to the test by blowing up a balloon with breathable air and then surrounding that with carbon dioxide and seeing if the balloon floats.
Should we put it to the test?
I think so. Let's go for it.
Okay, I have a mobile recorder here, which is going to allow me to roam out there with you. We're going to leave the studio and check it out.
Let's do it.
Let's go. All right.
Here we go.
There's a spiral staircase here. Ellie's going to walk up to the top of it.
Okay. I'm going to blow up the space pod.
Importantly, there is a whole column here. It's a big plastic tube, taller than a regular-sized human, maybe 7 feet tall or a bit taller. And in the bottom of it, it's sitting in a basin that has a lot of hot water. Okay? May I describe you? Okay, great. I can't tell if you're being invisible. Okay. We also have producer Dave here in some turbo gear ready to go to Venus. So, wow, okay. Head mask. Intense gloves. These gloves go all the way to Dave's elbows, and he's clutching a fire extinguisher. And a smock of some sort. Oh, a pillowcase. Okay.
A pillowcase. So we're going to spray this carbon dioxide fire extinguisher into this pillowcase, and then we're going to collect all of the dry ice that forms, and then we're going to tip it into this tube, and that's going to simulate the atmosphere of Venus.
He's got a fire extinguisher here and a pillowcase. Ah! Okay. Yep. That was just... Yeah.
Okay.
No fire here, but you're blowing it, and lots of white stuff is coming out.
All right.
Cool.
I've never done this before, by the way.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
Jeez, right by my face. It's really cold. It's blowing everywhere. Okay. Wow, pillowcase is full and there's white. Whoa, carbon dioxide.
Sorry, that's dry ice. That's why I needed the gloves.
He's reaching into the pillowcase, grabbing the dry ice. It sounds crunchy.
Yeah, there's some.
Cool. Okay, can I touch it?
No, yeah, briefly.
It's very cold.
It's very cold. Minus 78 or so, I think.
Minus 78.
So that is a solid gas. And it's turning directly from a solid into a gas, which is called sublimation.
Sublimation process right here, folks. Okay. Pillowcase full of carbon dioxide.
I'm going to get out of the way.
Heavy-duty producer Dave is climbing the stairs.
Pouring in the atmosphere.
Pouring in the atmosphere into the column of what will be Venus's surface at the bottom.
There we go.
And Ellie's blowing up a balloon. a yellow balloon. In the column, we've got really quite cloudy, the carbon dioxide at the bottom. Okay.
So what should be happening now is that dry ice turning into a gas form of carbon dioxide. And in here, in this balloon, I have breathable air where our humans can be living in the atmosphere of Venus. Shall we deploy the spacecraft?
Drop it in.
Okay, let's see if it floats.
Yes, it does.
Yes.
Is it floating a good 2 feet above the bottom of the column here? The carbon dioxide is allowing it to bob around. It's a floating city in a balloon.
Success! We are very excellent.
One of the interesting things about Venus is that ordinary breathable air will float, and I see you've done that test. You've actually floated balloons in the atmosphere of Venus with simulated atmosphere using dry ice. That is just so brilliant. People talk about, you could make cities, talk about the moon and float them in the balloons, talk about Mars, thousands of cities. We should make a balloon, cities that were huge, to lift on Venus. A 1 kilometer envelope, it could lift 700,000 tons. 1 kilometer sphere, it could lift, that's the mass, that's twice the mass of the Empire State Building. You could make cities, your little balloon, and float them in the balloon, shows that you can do it. Thousands of cities, shows that you can use cities that were huge. Breathable air, a 2 kilometer envelope, it could lift, would lift 6 million tons. Lift on Venus, it could lift 6 million tons. Let's colonize Venus. I envision one of these larger floating habitats to be not just a single bubble, but a cluster of bubbles, perhaps looking like a cluster of grapes. Picture a place with a lot of empty room and a lot of sunlight, gleaming like soap bubbles with iridescent colors. Lift on Venus. You could make cities and float them in the balloons. Iridescent colors. Thousands of cities. Cities that were huge. Lift on Venus. Colors. You could make cities. Your little balloon and float them in the balloon shows that you can do it. Thousands of cities shows that you can use cities that were huge. Breathable air. Colors. To lift on Venus. When you look out from the city, you're looking down on the brilliant white clouds because you're above the thick cloud deck of Venus. Then when you look up, the wispy clouds, and then of course above the wispy clouds, the brilliant blue atmosphere. Lift on Venus. You could make cities and float them in the balloons. Thousands of cities. Cities that were huge. Lift on Venus. You could make cities and float them in the balloons. Thousands of cities. Cities that were huge. Lift on Venus. Not just a single bubble, but a cluster of bubbles, perhaps looking like a cluster of grapes. And then as you look out across the cloud tops, you'll see other cities. Because there could be millions, there could be billions of other cities out there. So you'd see the other cities in the distance, gleaming in the sunlight, sort of glistening like clusters of soap bubbles just floating in the atmosphere. It could be very beautiful.
You have been listening to Hope Floats, presented by me, Britt Ray.
Me, Ellie Cosgrave.
Thank you so much for listening. Thank you also to Whistledown Productions.
And to producer Dave Dodd,
Anishka Sharma, Kevin Dawson. Also, don't forget musician Andy Gillum.
So a massive thanks to Chief Officer Graham Haterley and his emergency rescue crew who recorded that special onboard message for us. Check out their YouTube channel, Big Wave Master 1. We used a lot of sounds from freesound.org, so if you want to see a list of those sounds, check out our website,
bbc.co.uk/Tomorrow's World.
You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, #MyTomorrow,
and Instagram.
And next time, electric sheep.
Subscribe.